Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you are here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry by Ned and Constance Subletti. We're on chapter 43, which starts on page 606. It's titled, A Snake Biting Its Tail, and it starts with a quote from the Mobile Daily Register, dated January 1st, 1858. Labor to supply the demands of the South can be obtained only from Africa, and the laws of this country prevent the Southern people from obtaining this labor, branding those engaged in furnishing it with the opprobrious epithet of pirates and inflicting on them the punishment due to those guilty of the crime of piracy. So, this was an outrage because they couldn't get cheap African labor anymore because the slave breeding farms had driven up the price of domesticated homegrown slaves. This is what they were upset about. The coming of railroads ushered in a new era of capitalism on a scale impossible in the days when markets were linked only by water. Railroads required enormous sums of money to create with a national organization that functioned simultaneously elsewhere. But Dred Scott threw Western expansion plans into chaos. Railroad bonds dropped in price, and there was a panic. The Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company failed in August of 1857, raising fears of a bank run. Then the SS Central America, which sailed from Panama via Havana for New York, sank on September 12th in a hurricane 160 miles off the coast of Charleston. Down with the ship went 425 people. 153 more were saved, and a double digit number, perhaps 15 or 16 tons of gold from California, that was headed for the New York banks. Paper money could be replaced in the system, but not metal money. The loss was, by one estimate, equivalent to about 20% of the nation's gold reserves. In what has been remembered as the Panic of 1857, credit contracted sharply, and the banks stopped specie payments for 3 months or so. The panic originated in New York in part as a consequence of the local shortage of coin and in part as a consequence of the excessive speculation, with the buying of stocks to sell rather than holding having become a common financial activity. It was worsened by the credit contraction that banks imposed in response. The commercial crisis was strongly felt in the North, while the South had to some degree escaped it. Unfortunately, this led some to believe that the South could go it alone. Certainly, some Southerners were ruined when cotton prices dipped that year, and the disruption of commerce from New York occasioned the loss of money by many planters. One German observer wrote, in 1857, the year of the commercial crisis in America, many planters were compelled to sell a portion of their slaves in order to raise ready money, which at that time was not to be had on the best security even at 50% interest. And I saw a planter bring 100 slaves to market at one time, who certainly, after that sale, must have been obliged to leave half his plantation uncultivated. When a planter had a debt crisis, his captives were dispersed. As failures became larger and larger, hundreds of people were occasionally sold at once, fragmenting an entire community each time. James Gadsden of Gadsden Purchase fame bought the Cooper River plantation of Pimlico in 1852. After his death, 6 years later, his 235 slaves, accustomed to the culture of rice and provisions, were sold to 30 different buyers in a sale advertised throughout the South, all the way to Texas. The Panic of 1857 was strongly felt in the West, leading New York businessmen to focus their commerce even more closely on the cotton producing South, offering long credit terms, even as leading Southerners focused on finding ways to become economically independent from New York. Slave prices dipped in 1857, but slaves held their value better than cotton, and prices quickly recovered and climbed with yet another bumper crop. As the economy rebounded, slave prices reached new highs, raising the entry barrier to planter status yet further. So, this is their class war happening right here, because to get into the planter class was to be a part of the leisure class, because you had somebody, you hired human capital, you owned human capital to do all the labor for you. There could be no quicker way to get the price of slaves down than to reopen the African slave trade, which would create enormous profits for Charleston slave merchants while investing a new generation of purchasers in the slavery system. An article in DuBose Review pitched the idea as a solution to the problem of white social inequity in the South. At present prices, it is almost impossible that the mere laborer can ever own slaves, however much he may wish to share in that desirable commodity of slave labor. It is done up in packages too large for common use. The foreign slave trade will bring slaves enough for all and at prices which poorer men may purchase. It will thus bring all the ruling race to the same social standpoint. Again, this was a class war. It will thus reintegrate and erect our social system. It will abolish the odious distinctions between slave owners and non slave owners, because everybody would own slaves. It will increase the laboring element of our population. It will thus extend our capacity for production, and in doing all this, it will give the promise of a more abundant wealth and open the prospect to a broader and brighter future than was ever expanded to the eye of man. Though Virginians, needless to say, opposed reopening the African trade because they had breeding farms, it was an editorial priority of the Charleston papers, beginning in about 1853. As South Carolina systematically attempted to expand its influence, measures promoting the incorporation of African labor appeared in the legislatures of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, none of which succeeded. Perhaps because they would have been in order to avert defiance of federal law. It was not a popular notion among the mass of Southern whites who did not want new Africans complicating their society, nor even for all slave owners, but for some, it would have been a bonanza, and it was a useful political cudgel. Though the trade was not reopened, the initiative was not without effect. As W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out, the agitation did succeed in sweeping away nearly all theoretical opposition to the trade and left the majority of Southern people in an attitude which regarded the opening of the African slave trade as merely a question of expediency. So it wasn't if the trade was going to happen for these people, it was when was the trade going to happen for the people, because owning slaves was the quickest way to raise their economic and social status. Because if they owned slaves, they could work the land. If they worked the land, they would have profits. And if they had profits, they could generate more money, and it would be a production cycle. This was a capitalistic adventure. In South Carolina, where reopening the African slave trade at critical moments was a political and commercial tradition dating back to the colonial days, agitating to reopen the foreign trade was a way of putting pressure on Virginia. There was a tactical problem that went back to the negotiations over the Constitution. An independent Southern Confederacy would need Virginia's heft, strategic location, and money. But reopening the foreign slave trade was a deal breaker that would have devalued the Virginians' slave property. Virginia is still a poor state to this very day, and so is Mississippi, because that is what they base their economies on: slave labor. Outside of the Cotton Belt, there was always substantial political will to keep the African trade closed. The specter of a reopened African slave trade appeared in the Lincoln Douglas debates of 1858, when the two men were contending for the position of senator from Illinois. Though neither of the two men was in favor of reopening the African trade, Lincoln went on the offensive. Stephen Douglas advocated popular sovereignty regarding slavery, which meant each state was free to make its own determination about the institution. This is where they get the idea that slavery was about states' rights. In what became known as the House Divided speech, Lincoln argued that the logical consequence of this would be reopening for the trade. For years, he, Douglas, has labored to prove it a sacred right of white men to take Negro slaves into the new territories. How can he possibly show that it is less sacred a right to buy them where they can be bought cheapest? And unquestionably, they can be bought cheaper in Africa than in Virginia. This was about economics. The fact that African slaves were cheaper than Virginia slaves because Virginia slaves were internally bred. They were on breeding farms. They didn't have a sense of history, culture, and lineage. These people had been cut off from their historical memory. So they didn't have the same fight in them that an African slave had in them. Additionally, an African slave could take the fight that they had and spread that to a person on the breeding farm, teaching them about what freedom was, what liberty was, what it was to be a man, establishing his own will and destiny. This is what they were combating. In spite of bumper crops, the overheating slave market was threatening agricultural prosperity. The Mobile Daily Register warned of dangerous levels of credit exposure, dated January 19th, 1859, high prices for Negroes. Our exchanges from all parts of the South and West are teeming with notices of the extraordinary high prices at which Negroes are now selling, either on the block or at private sale. And the question naturally presents itself: what is the cause of it? Can the present high price of cotton be the cause? If so, a return in value of the product of the Negro sufficient to justify a purchase at the prices now ruling cannot be the case. And all reasoning based on this proposition proves ephemeral. For the influx of slaves this season into the cotton and sugar growing states is enormous. It is supposed that from Augusta, Georgia alone, for the last 3 months, that shipments south and west by trains averaged 200 daily, while the tide of emigration by way of other points of proportionately as great. Some estimate the import of Negroes into the cotton growing states alone will increase the next crop by 200,000 bales. It should be noted that they didn't want free thinking Africans and free thinking Negroes coming into these slave states because that was going to make them more of a threat to white people. The present amount of home slave labor should still be sufficient to till the lands now open and under cultivation. But with this large increase of laborers, new lands must be opened and cultivated, and their yield must be on sale in the market next year. Now, will the demand for cotton be equal to the supply? If the Negroes had been purchased on time, and we are satisfied that such is the case with a large proportion of them, a decline of a few cents in cotton would produce a reaction that must necessarily seriously embarrass the planting interests that have purchased on those terms. It is too much the custom for planters to anticipate their crops in dollars and cents and shape their liabilities accordingly. The demand for labor is good, but we do not think that it justifies the exorbitant and high prices and rates which prevail, although the South was never more solvent than now. Capital for a new African slave trade would have been easily available in New York, where businessmen were still financing an African trade to Cuba. At least 350,000 Africans were carried to Brazil in the 1840s, writes Don E. Ferenchenbacher. At least half of those importations were achieved with American help of some kind. But the British Navy, which had been actively pursuing slave traders for 30 years, cut off the Brazilian trade sharply in 1850 and finishing it entirely by 1852. Besides British coercion, there was a familiar economic logic to the shutdown. The established Brazilian planters had imported so many that they had more than enough for their needs. Now, as new plantations were carved out of the forest in southern Brazil, a domestic slave trade began from the old slave area into the new one, as a forced north to south migration began in Brazil. What they're saying is that breeding farms existed in Brazil as well. Similar to the United States interstate trade, this interprovincial trade was the only other sizable such trade in the hemisphere. Brazil was the last country in the hemisphere to end slavery, which happened in 1888, developing a mass abolitionist movement in the final years. Cuba, which was still a colony of Spain, ended slavery in 1886 in the face of growing independentist sentiment. After 1850, only Cuba was left importing slaves. It was done with an extensive connivance from within the United States, whose ships were by treaty immune from below decks search by British cruisers. Slaving above the Bight of Benin had largely been stopped, but whole villages were still being ripped out of Yorubaland and Dahomean slave raids and carried off to sugar mills in the areas of Matanzas, Havana, and elsewhere, and the Central African ports continued selling slaves. We don't care for the English squadron, boasted an imprisoned slave ship captain in New York in an 1855 interview published in the anti slavery New York Evangelist and reprinted in the pro slavery DuBose Review. We run up the American flag, and if they come on board, all we have to do is show our American papers, and they have no right to search us. The captain estimated that his brig had cost $13,000 to outfit and brought in $220,000 on one run to Cuba, a rate of return from which one successful venture could absorb the costs of several failed ones. So it was to their advantage to continue trying to steal and enslave people, because they were making upwards of 20 times the amount of their initial investment. Affirming that New York was the king of the trade, the captain was asked how he outfitted his ships. He said, "I can go down to South Street and go into a number of houses that help to outfit ships for the business. I don't know how far they own the vessels or receive the profits of the cargoes. I had rather not have American owners. I prefer Spaniards or Portuguese. But these houses know all about it. They know me. They see me sail out of port with a ship and come back with a passenger. They know that when a cargo of slaves is landed, the vessel is often destroyed, not to be a witness against her officers and crew." So, what they would do is outfit the ships to transport slaves. They would sail out of the American port with their American papers and their American flag, which barred them from being able to be searched by British ships. Then they would bring those ships back to the American port. Okay, they would send them to South America, then bring them back to the American port, offload the ship, destroy the ship, which is why the question of where are the ships makes no sense, because they often destroyed the ships so that there wouldn't be any evidence of the crimes that they were committing. The colonial era delay of months on the African coast while assembling a cargo piecemeal was a thing of the past. The African side of the business had gotten steadily more industrial, so slavers in the 1850s were frequently able to pull up their African destination port and choose a cargo of as many as 1,200 people from among those held captive in what amounted to a wholesale warehouse maintained by factors. The captain continued, "Boys and women are kept on the upper deck, but all the strong men, those giant Africans that might make us trouble, we put below on the slave deck." He was asked, "Do you chain them or put them in handcuffs?" "No, never. They would die. We let them move about." "Are you very severe with them?" "We have to be pretty strict at first for a week or so to make them feel that we are masters. Then we lighten up for the rest of the voyage." "How do you pack them at night?" "They lay down on the deck, on their sides, body to body. There would not be enough room for all to lie flat on their backs." "Did many die along the passage?" "Yes, I lost a good many last cruise, more than ever before. Sometimes we find them unalived when we go below for the morning. Then we throw them overboard." Morality was decreasing on the voyages because steam vessels now made the cruise from Africa to Cuba in as little as 18 days. The year end 1859 British report from Havana to Her Majesty's Commissioners on the slave trade noted that Madagascar had become a new staging ground for East African Arab traders selling people principally from Mozambique, referring to Mozambique Island off the coast of the present day country of Mozambique to slavers bound for Cuba. Such expeditions not unfrequently originate in the United States of America, from whence they take their departure, and there are at present here. We understand agents from Boston and New Orleans who are engaged in completing the subscriptions for shares, which have been already in part filled up by American capitalists. One of these schemes is for a ship of 900 tons to bring 2,000 slaves under charge of an experienced slaver who has made no less than 13 successful voyages. It seems that Negroes are to be had on the east coast of Africa for about $28 each. And even so, they are paid for in goods, which upon there is at least 100% profit. We learn that ships to be employed in this unholy traffic with their goods for barter on board and prepared with sufficient iron fitting tanks for supply of water proceed from the United States under American colors to a port in Madagascar. The slave deck is laid in safely without hindrance, and they take in their cargoes of human misery, the victims being brought over from the opposite coast of Africa in Arab vessels. And we have been told that such are the facilities and arrangements that a very large cargo of slaves can be completed in 2 or 3 days. The commissioners accounted for 12,744 Africans introduced illegally into Cuba in 1858. Of the 20 voyages that brought them, 11 were in American vessels. Certain that there was more traffic than they knew about, the commissioners rounded their estimate up by a third to almost 17,000. With Africans selling in Havana at $1,000 or more, having been bought at $28, the profits on such voyages were immense. A merchant could afford to pay out bribes and even burn the ship if necessary. New York merchants, especially, were involved in the financing, but a wide variety of U.S. maritime centers participated in the trade, including Baltimore and New Orleans. W.E.B. Du Bois's list, compiled from the congressional documents, shows vessels from Portland, Maine, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Boston, Rhode Island, Mystic, Connecticut, and Philadelphia. The Echo, which was a brig carrying about 475 slaves out of about the 625 it started with, was captured by the U.S. Navy off the coast of Cuba in August of 1858. And though the captain and crew were found not guilty at their trials, the captives were sent to Africa, not back to their homes, but to Monrovia, Liberia, where inevitably a new composite culture was developing among people from various parts of Africa who had been left there. The American ship Haidee, Haidee, which left Quilongo on the Angolan coast with about 1,145 captives, brought the 903 of them who were still alive into the Cuban port of Cardenas. on September 8, 1859. Julian Zuleta, the enormously wealthy Basque trader who had commissioned the voyage together with partners, took them on an estate with an escort of about 200 armed men. The bribes on this scandalous occasion were said to have amounted to about $200,000. By the end of 1859, reported the British judge in Havana, we have the information of the introduction of no less than 39 cargoes with 22,855 Negroes. Add to that which one third, as usual, and we have the enormous number of 30,473 landed here in this year. Reporting from Luanda, where more than 3 centuries of the slave trade had depopulated the countryside, Her Majesty's acting commissioner wrote, "It is obvious that the only flag which the guilty adventurers in the slave trade now assume will cover their crime is the American." The slave owners of the Low Countries saw all of this as another instance of Northern hypocrisy. Americans in free soil states were building fortunes illegally in the foreign slave trade. But since none of the slaves came to the United States, Carolina planters were denied the use of cheap African labor while they continued paying a protectionist markup on slaves to Virginia's benefit. And Carolina merchants were denied the use of their harbor as a slave depot. Despite all the illegal African slave trading, with the exception of the well known cases of the Wanderer in 1858 and the Clotilda in 1860, and perhaps a few others that left little trace, Africans were not imported directly into the American South. When in late 1859, President Buchanan sent a secret agent named Benjamin F. Slocum to travel from North Carolina to Texas as a potential slave buyer with a mission of looking for evidence of African slave vessels arriving. Slocum found that reports concerning the landing of Africans, except in the case of the yacht the Wanderer, were unreliable in mere fabrications. Joseph Bruin, the large New Orleans slave trader, told Slocum that that there were none in town, as it was not a safe business, but that about 100 Africans had been sold in and about New Orleans last spring and hurried away. Some historians believe that some or many clandestine shipments of Africans came to the Gulf Coast from Havana, while others say that cargoes were smuggled along the Georgia coastline. It is certainly possible that there is no direct documentation. There wouldn't be. And moreover, there is no trace of them in documentation about the markets where Africans did not, so far as we know, turn up. If such shipments did come, they presumably went directly to large plantations under high secrecy. But high secrecy was not all that easy in polemical, newspaper heavy 19th century America. Africans for sale in the open market would have been big news and would have certainly been mentioned in slave owners and traders' letters. For the labor networks of the South to have been supplied with African bodies in any more substantial way would have been to left would have left traces that do not exist. Whether some Africans came in clandestinely via Havana or not, The slave breeding industry remained well protected. The two African slave ships that we do know of were highly conspicuous. The Wanderer was outfitted by Charles Augustus Lafayette Lamar, a loose cannon financier and speedboater from Savannah. Lamar was the son of a New York bank president, G.B. Lamar, who would shortly be a part of a cockamamie plan supported by pro Confederate New York Mayor Fernando Wood to have the city cede in sympathy with the South. His voyage was an open secret, intended to rebuke and definance in defiance of the federal ban. Lamar's investors included several major slave traders who were all taking a considerable risk since they were committing a capital crime. One was Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, whose business by this time reached from Texas to Georgia and who bragged about his interest in the Wanderer expedition to a newspaper reporter in 1869. Savannah historian Sheehy et al. Write that Lamar calculated that if he could maneuver this confrontation into his own backyard of Savannah, he could win. This victory would in turn undermine the federal law banning the importation of African slaves. But win or lose, he hoped the importation of Africans would drive a wedge between the North and South and elect a Republican Party president, something he was sure would trigger secession. At the Angolan slave port of Benguela, 487 people were densely packed into Lamar's Wanderer, a small, fast sailing vessel built as a pleasure craft that flew the flag of the New York Yacht Club. They were young, in keeping with the market requirements, and many were children. About 409 of them were still alive when the Wanderer came ashore on Jekyll Island, a little south of Savannah, on November 28, 1858. The crew was arrested immediately, but Lamar got the ship back and quickly disposed of the slaves. One African boy, the only remaining witness, was abducted at gunpoint from jail and never seen again. The crew members were put on trial and acquitted. Secret Agent Slocum's previously mentioned report to President Buchanan contains some information about what happened to the Wanderer's captives. None of them went to Charleston, he reported, from that city. Some had passed through to Mobile on the way to Louisiana. 30 were sold in Vicksburg by Nathan Bedford Forrest, and 7 in Memphis, also by Forrest. Some wound up in Texas, which was supposed to be a free state. Lamar was also a horse racer. He owned the 10 Broke Race Course in Savannah, where on March 2nd and 3rd of 1859, a little more than 3 months after the Wanderer arrived, Georgia's all-time biggest slave auction was held to pay down the debts Pierce Meese Butler had incurred speculating in on the stock market. The broker conducting the sale, whose name was Joseph Bryan, owned the largest slave jail in town, on Bryan Street, facing Johnson Square. But even so, he couldn't manage an in-house sale of that size, so he moved it to Timbroke. The people were to be sold needed housing in the stables. A northern newspaper reporter attempting to make notes on the sale would have been ejected if not violently abused, so Mortimer Thompson writing for the Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, went incognito, posing as a buyer. When his article, Great Auction Sale of Slaves at Savannah, Georgia, March 2nd and 3rd, 1859, was published on March 9th, it caused an international sensation and was a public relations disaster for Savannah. Writing under the name Hugh K. Philander Doesticks, Thompson reported hearing at the auction strong sentiments in favor of reopening the African slave trade and described the scene here, saying, "For several days before the sale, every hotel in Havana was crowded with Negro speculators from the North and the South, from North and South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana, who had been attracted hither by the prospects of making good bargains. Nothing was heard for days in the bar rooms and public rooms but talk of the great sale." The community on Butler's Sea Island plantations numbered about 900. Half of them were owned by the estate of Butler's deceased brother John, but Butler's 436 went to the auction block there to be sold by what Southerners reckoned a humane method. In families, though of course such sales still broke family ties. So half of the community would remain and half would disappear. The auction realized about $303,850, which would have been about $8.7 million in 2014. The sale was particularly painful since this community was so deeply rooted. None of the Butler's slaves had ever been sold before, but have been on two on these two plantations since they were born, wrote Thompson. Who can tell how closely intertwined are the affections of a little band of 400 persons living isolated from all the world beside, from birth to middle age? They do not naturally become one great family, each man a brother unto each. Thompson reported a conversation whose sentiment was more than once repeated. A negative response by a prospective purchaser when asked if he would be buying a woman named Sally. "Well, Major, I think not. Sally's a good, big, strapping gal and can do a heap of work, but it's 5 years since she had any children. She's done breeding, I reckon." The Tim Brock sale is popularly remembered by the phrase "the weeping time," which also refers to the weather. 4 straight days of rain stopped when the sale ended. The auction was up in the grandstand, a room about 100 feet long, where they lined up and waited their turn to go on the block. Thompson tells us that as the wind howled outside and through the open side of the building, the driving rain came pouring in. Auctioneer Thomas J. Walsh announced the terms: 1/3 cash, the remainder payable in 2 equal annual installments, bearing interest from the day of sale, to be secured by approved mortgage and personal security, or approved acceptances in Savannah, Georgia, or Charleston, South Carolina. Purchasers to pay for papers. As the sale wound down, Pierce Butler, moving along and among his former slaves, carrying canvas bags from which he sorrowfully handed each one of them four gleaming new 25-cent pieces fresh from the mint, $1 apiece, as if to say, it wasn't my fault. But when the sale was concluded, Butler's debts were paid, and he was a rich man again. He celebrated by going on an extended trip to the Mediterranean. Though Butler experienced the auction as a terrible humiliation, it turned out in the long run to have been a good business move. He cashed out of his slave holdings while they were still worth something. While it was not hard to tell in 1859 that war was coming, there was no reason for planters to believe the end of chattel slavery was around the corner. Quite the contrary, it was a time honored institution that had never been stronger. There were more slaves than ever. The cash value of approximately 4 million people then enslaved in the United States embodied a phenomenal sum of money. Though the Timbrook Racecourse no longer exists as such, a historical marker was placed in a small commemorative area on the former site on March 2nd, 2008. Another spot of sacred ground marked and acknowledged. It was about the same time as the Timbrook sale, sometime in early 1859, that a castle of the Knights of the Golden Circle opened in Baltimore. Founded in 1854 and based in the Free Territory of Cincinnati, Ohio, the Knights of the Golden Circle was a pro slavery secret society that had consolidated with the Order of the Lone Star, which had been somewhat directionless after the death of John Quitman in July of 1858. The KGC wanted to secede from the United States and take over Mexico. In Virginia, the cherished diffusionist notion that the slave population would be eliminated by sell off had not become reality. 4.5 decades after the Battle of New Orleans, Virginia was still exporting slaves to the Deep South, although planters had been living for generations off the earnings of slave breeding, exactly as abolitionists charged. Virginia's slave population had increased by 1860 to 865,000, even though Maryland and Delaware's had diminished. In an editorial in the Richmond Enquirer dated May 25th, 1858, it was made clear the extent to which the Virginia economy still depended on the export to the South and West of domestically raised African Americans, as well as how alarming the loss of its protected status to a reopened trade would be. If dissolution of the Union is to be followed by the revival of the African slave trade, Virginia had better consider whether the South of the North Confederacy would not be far more preferable for her than the North of a Southern Confederacy. In a Northern Confederacy, Virginia would derive a large amount from the sale of her slaves to the South and gain the increased value in her lands from Northern immigration. Within the Southern Confederacy, with the African slave trade revived, she would lose two-thirds of the value of her slave property and derive no additional increase to the value of her lands. The South Carolinians would make sure that Virginia slave breeders would not be able to sit out their war. John Brown's attempt to ignite a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry in what is now West Virginia at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers began on October 16th, 1859, and was suppressed 2 days later by Lieutenant J.E.B. Stuart under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee. Frederick Douglass was one of the first, perhaps 80 people who knew about John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in advance. Though he tried to talk Brown out of this suicidal act that lit the match for the war, he didn't inform on him, which was enough to make him a conspirator. Douglas fled the country to Canada and then on to London, returning home the following year. Robert E. Lee's report, filed on October 19th, described Brown's action not as Northern aggression, but as an attempt by a fanatic or madman who could only end in failure. But Brown's attempt to start a slave rebellion galvanized the South, where it had been seen by the political and intellectual class as proof that the Black Republicans, a contemptuous name for the party of Chase and Seward, had in store for them. The Charleston Mercury noted on October 20th that three New York newspapers with different political affiliations that all concur in opinion as to the desperate condition of the Democratic Party throughout the North and the imminent prospect of the Black Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives and President of the United States being lifted to power. Let none, however, expect Seward to be the candidate of that party. We at least have never thought so, but we are confident someone less committed, yet equally Black Republican, such as Solomon P. Chase or Supreme Court Judge John McLean, would also be put forward. But whether Seward or Chase or McLean, to the South, the difference is small. It is the candidate of a hostile sectional party whose success put must put the South as unprotected tributaries at the feet of inimical rulers. So what they're saying there is that if these three or four Black Republicans or people that are diametrically opposed to slavery for whatever reason got into office, then it's over for the South. It wasn't just about Lincoln. In the eyes of the Mercury, any Black Republican president would have been cause for war. The number of Southern vigilance committees grew. John Brown wasn't hanged until December 2nd, and that wasn't good enough for slaveholders because he didn't stop talking until he was hanged and never strayed from his from his calm, righteous tone. Brown's execution, which was witnessed by the wealthy, successful, and well connected radical young actor John Wilkes Booth, a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, elevated him to the status of martyr. In his memory, new lyrics were put to an old campfire meeting song with a stirring chorus of Glory Hallelujah to make the great song of military campaign that ended slavery. John Brown body lies a molding in the grave. That's crazy. After the Wanderer, only one more slave ship containing Africans is known to have arrived in the United States. On an unknown date, in the summer of 1860, the Clotilda brought to Magazine Point on Mobile Bay 110 captives from the Ouida in the Fon speaking state of Dahomey. Ouida was a more cosmopolitan city than Mobile, notes Sylvain Diouf in her study about the Clotilda shipmates, which tells us that most captives were the people now called Yoruba, though that ethnonym was not yet in general use. They were practitioners of the Orisha religion. The Clotilda's captives had been taken by the Dahomey king Galele. Some were from Atakora in what is now northwest Benin. Others were Fon speakers from Dahomey. Still others were Muslim. One Gupa, who became known as Peter Lee, was a Dahomeyan nobleman who practiced voodoo. This ship, which could easily have gone to Havana or Matanzas, was one more or less representative of the dramatic, high volume African cultural transplantation to Cuba that was by then in its final days and would prove highly consequential for 20th century Afro Cuban culture. One survivor of the Clotilda, Cujo Lewis, lived until 1935. One of the relatively few Yoruba to be brought to the United States territory, he described the slave raid in which he was captured, recalling that the warriors who killed the unsaleable people and kidnapped the remainder were women. The Dahomeyan kings favored the use of female soldiers, and that as they took them to Abomi, they were hanging from their belts the severed heads of the captives, unfortunate family members who had been slaughtered in the raid. After 3 days, the heads were decomposing, so the coffle stopped along the way for 9 days as the soldiers smoked the heads over a fire to preserve them. The heads, along with the live slaves, were to be ceremonially sold to the king of Dahomey, a state organized for the purpose of slave raiding. So, what he's saying is that the male head of Dahomey and that Dahomey was a state that was organized exclusively for the purpose of slave trading, and that it was a man at the top, but he had his female soldiers. Most of the Clotilda captives remained enslaved in the Mobile area. With the end of slavery, many of them reassembled. In 1866, they established their community under Gumpa's leadership as African Town, which he led for 30 years or so. After Gumpa's son with his shipmate Josephina was born, writes Diouf, they had the baby tattooed on the chest with the image of a snake biting its own tail. Ultimately, many voodooists in Haiti have subsequently done the same, but Gumpa became a Baptist. His descendants still live in the area. By the time the Clotilda sailed, the African trade was already feeling the heat of President Buchanan's program of stepped up American anti slave trade enforcement off the African coast. But as we have previously emphasized, suppressing the slave trade was a different issue than abolishing slavery, which President Buchanan had no intention of doing. Many secessionists approved of his stopping the illegal African slave trade. They weren't making any money from it, and harassing it kept the ships of the tiny U.S. Navy busy. and far, far away. So, as you can see, our enslavement was no joke. It was about money and class for them. So slavery was the way that they saw as them being able to pull up their peasant class so that there would not be any division because they had not figured out that if they tell this white man that you're better than a black man, that you are good. They had not learned how to commoditize whiteness yet, but they were learning. They were in their learning curve as they felt it necessary to figure out a way to consolidate the white race against the black race. Assignment in Paraguay starts with a quote from the Bible, the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, verses 44 through 46, which says, and is quoted as saying, both thy bondmen and thy bondmaids which thou shalt have shall be of the heathen that are around you. Of them all ye shall buy bondmen and bondmaids. Moreover, of the children of the stranger that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and of their families that are with you shall you begat in your land, and they shall be your possession. And ye shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you, and inherit them for a possession. They shall be your bondmen forever, but over your brethren, the children of Israel, ye shall not rule one over another with rigor. So it wasn't that they couldn't have his Israelite slaves, they just weren't supposed to put them in the same type of enslavement that they put heathens and foreigners in. President Buchanan conducted his administration in such a way as to leave his successor crippled. Some of Buchanan's few biographers have defended him against the charge of being part of a Southern conspiracy. But however one cares to address the topic, the notion that Buchanan could have been aware of having methodically put the Union in the most disadvantaged position possible does not pass the smell test. His contemporaries certainly thought that this is what he was doing. Buchanan announced at the beginning of his term that he, like Polk, would be a one-term president, in effect, setting the secession clock ticking. He sent the U.S. Navy as far away as he could, where its personnel could not be easily available for duty in the event that, say, Carolinians or Mississippians should declare their independence, as their leaders were constantly threatening to do. In 1858, he ordered a fleet of 19 ships, 7 of them chartered with merchant vessels of 200 guns, manned by 2,500 sailors and marines, on an unprecedented mission to Paraguay, where a U.S. sailor had been killed in a river incident 3 years prior. Paraguay is a landlocked country, so the Navy had to ascend 3 rivers. Most of the vessels stopped at Rosario, Argentina, and 2 continued onto the Paraguayan capital of Asuncion, where they demanded an apology and extorted a new commercial treaty. Following the completion of that expensive, time-consuming errand, Buchanan sent the Navy to the African coast to police the slave trade. And indeed, for the first time, American enforcement did make a dent in it. The only captain ever hanged according to the legal penalty for engaging in the slave trade was one Nathaniel Gordon. He was executed in 1862 under Lincoln, but he had been prosecuted and convicted during the Buchanan administration. Riddled with procurement scandals, bribery, and emergency loans, as well as spending extravagantly on military adventures, Buchanan's administration proved to be highly corrupt, entering office with a $1.3 million surplus. Buchanan left behind a $25.2 million deficit, while government debt ballooned from 28 million to 76.4 million dollars. Buchanan's Secretary of the Treasury was Howell Cobb, an old Jacksonian friend and Georgia cotton planter, and at one time the owner of 1,000 slaves. Ostensibly a Unionist and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Cobb in 1856 published a scriptural examination of the institution of slavery, a Bible thumping defense of divinely ordained property rights in slaves that execrated various individual abolitionists, in which he complained, "This is a mere sample, that amongst the most successful schemes of mischief brought forth by abolitionists may be reckoned that what is familiarly called the Underground Railroad. By this means, many owners have been deprived of their property by persons esteeming themselves and being esteemed by their associates pious, asserting that enslaved women reproduce like rabbits. The slave breeding Cobb in 1858 told the Georgia Cotton Planters Association, of which he was the secretary, that the proprietor's largest source of prosperity was in the Negroes that he raises. He was one of the key people informally known as the Buccaneers, who helped make the Buchanan presidency a fiscal scandal of historic proportions. With him at the helm of Treasury, Buchanan ran his entire term on deficit financing, which Andrew Jackson would have regarded as a mortal sin, if not treason. Such a thing might not seem so strange to modern readers, since the Federal Reserve can now print money to meet the government's obligations. But this was an era in which there was no national paper currency. After 3 decades of a Jacksonian fiscal regime, the government was required to shift the physical location of pieces of gold and silver in order for federal spending to occur. Besides the naval operations in Paraguay and Africa, Buchanan sent the U.S. Army to Utah in 1857 to confront the theocratic Mormon state of Desiree. That was before there was a railroad to get the troops out there. They had to go on horseback, far from telephone lines. Though hostilities ended in 1858, the Army remained in Utah through the remainder of Buchanan's presidency. Buchanan's vice president was Kentuckian John C. Breckinridge, the grandson of the man who had introduced Jefferson's anonymous Kentucky resolutions in the first branded doctrine of nullification. As the Democrats split into Northern and Southern factions, Vice President Breckinridge ran for president in 1860 on the Southern Democratic ticket, with a platform that was essentially a threat if he lost, that the South would secede. He did, and it did. When Lincoln won the election, it was with a plurality of votes in a four-way split. His name had not even been on the ballot in the southern states. In his final lame duck State of the Union address on December 3rd, 1860, Buchanan explained the problem to the nation. The abolitionists made them do it. The long continued and intemperate interference of the Northern people with the question of slavery in the Southern states has at length produced its natural effects. By this point, Northern bankers were refusing to buy Treasury notes for fear that the money would go south, nor were they likely to invest in a situation in which the South was poised to repudiate its debts. Rhett's Charleston Mercury wanted a new government now. There was no time to lose. Strike while the South has the momentum and the North is in transition. Many in the North had thought that the Southern Hotspurs wouldn't really succeed. The plan to defeat the unprepared and the South thought irresolute North hinged on the idea of a quick mobilization. Howell Cobb had advised the secessionists to wait until the day of Lincoln's inauguration, which would have saved their old friend Buchanan considerable embarrassment, but they ignored his advice. So Cobb resigned as Secretary of the Treasury on December 8th to get in on the ground floor of the new country. It was clear what Cobb had done, wrote Henry Adams in the Boston Daily Advertiser of December 13th. Everyone knows that Buchanan has neglected to garrison Fort Moultrie. That Secretary Cobb has so managed the Treasury as to weaken the new administration as far as possible, and that Mr. Floyd, who is John Floyd of Virginia, who is the Secretary of War, has as good a place large amounts of national arms in the hands of the South Carolinians. As secession was declared in one state after another, Buchanan did nothing to stop it. Instead, he let them go to form slaveholders' confederacies that would attack and invade the United States once he was gone, and a less compliant president inaugurated. Before Lincoln took office in March, unidentified thieves removed all the remaining specie from the federal treasury in Washington. In William P. McKinnon's words, by the time Abraham Lincoln took office in March of 1861, the country's largest military garrison was in the desert, 40 miles southwest of Salt Lake City, and the new administration could neither buy stationery nor meet the federal payroll. The two circumstances were not unrelated. What little money the United States government had was in the form of pieces of metal scattered around the far flung country. That was how the South wanted it. Moreover, the secession of 7 states from the Union meant that many Northern creditors would be burned, if not ruined, seizing up the nation's commercial cash flow. Many of the merchants had been in favor of appeasing the South, but once they were stiffed by their Southern debtors, they became staunch Unionists. Greetings, Sister Raw and the elders listening with you. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. We're reading The American Slave Coast. We're on chapter 44, page 624, talking about how the secession happened. How secession happened. The secessionist campaign was planned and executed by a wealthy group of men who had been at war with the government years before they equipped an army against it. Their propaganda machine ran full blast. Disunion was the only permissible stance. With the Charleston Mercury leading the charge, newspapers throughout the South hammered it home every day. When word of Lincoln's election came, the fire eaters were already mobilizing. Robert Barnwell Rhett and others founded the Minutemen for the Defense of Southern Rights, which was an action group, in October of 1860, while the Knights of the Golden Circle were establishing parliamentary forces elsewhere. Remember, John Wilkes Booth was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. So he was a secessionist, which is another reason why I guess he annihilated Lincoln. South Carolina had been the state most likely to secede since the beginnings of the nation. Indeed, it had barely joined the United States except for reasons of defense, which had been moribund since the removal of the Spanish, the British, and the local Native Americans following the War of 1812. All the slaves in Maryland might be bought out now at half price with a liberal discount for cash, wrote Henry Adams the week before South Carolina seceded. Not all the slave states were determined to secede, however, and in order to evangelize on behalf of disunion, the governors of Mississippi and Alabama sent secession commissioners to the various slave states. Alabama's commissioner to South Carolina, John Archer Elmore, arrived in time to address the first evening session of the South Carolina Secession Convention on December 17th, 1860, warning them of what they already believed, that Lincoln's election was an avowed declaration of war upon their institutions, their rights, and the interests of the South. The dictatorates that sent out secession commissioners tried to send natives of the states that they were sent to. So Mississippi's commissioner to North Carolina was a North Carolina born Jacob Thompson, President Buchanan's Secretary of the Interior. So he had just left political office. It was straight up treason. Thompson was still a cabinet officer when he arrived in Raleigh on December 18th to deliver a barn burner of a speech characterized by the message of emancipation, humiliation, subjugation, and ruin that ran through the commissioner's message like a scarlet thread, writes Carl B. Dew in his History of the Secession Commissions. The South Carolina Convention voted unanimously on December 20th to secede from the nation. Anyone who might have dissented had long since been weeded out. When it was Robert Barnwell Rhett's turn to ascend to the stage and take his turn signing the secessionist papers in the presence of 3,000 cheering Carolinians, the most tireless and pugnacious disunionist of all fell to his knees, lifted his hands upward towards the heavens, and bowed his head in prayer, writes his biographer. So as you can see, they were quite passionate. They were quite passionate about seceding from the Union. South Carolina sent out well-coached secessionist commissioners, focusing them on the idea of a constitutional convention at Montgomery. Their commissioner to Alabama was John C. Calhoun's son, Andrew. Raised from birth at a high pitch of pro-slavery hysteria, the younger Calhoun had in November recalled that the Haitians had risen up with all the fury of a beast and scenes were enacted over comparatively few planters that the white fiends of the North would delight to see reenacted with us now. As the appeals to secede became more intense, they became less economic and more emotional. If you don't support the slave owners, you will be the victim of the slaves. After winding up himself for several pages, Alabama Secessionist Commissioner Stephen F. Hale reached the boiling point of Negrophobia that Haiti represented in this by now ritualized discourse, augmented as usual by the image of the violation of white women, when he said, "The election of Mr. Lincoln cannot be regarded otherwise than an open declaration of war, for the triumph of this new theory of government destroys the property of the South, lays waste to her fields, and inaugurates all the horrors of San Domingo servile insurrection, consigning her citizens to assassinations and her wives and daughters to the pollution and violation to gratify the lust of half civilized Africans. Especially is this true in the cotton growing states, where in many localities the slave outnumbers the white population 10 to 1." And that's an interesting statement because what he's acknowledging is that there were more black people in many of these areas than there were white people. And so where did all these black people go is what you have to ask yourself. Because if our numbers have consistently outpaced their numbers and they're just now acknowledging the birth dearth, then where did those black people go? Continuing. But the economic argument predominated. In a December 27th, 1860 letter to Kentucky Governor Beriah Magoffin, Hale put it down squarely to property rights in human beings. African slavery has become not only one of the fixed domestic institutions of the Southern states, but forms an important element of their political power and constitutes the most valuable species of their property worth, according to recent estimates, not less than $4 billion, forming, in fact, the basis on which rests the prosperity and wealth of most of these states. Howell Cobb, the former Treasury Secretary of President Buchanan, supervised the hasty, secretive drafting of the Confederate Constitution at Montgomery, Alabama, with a team that included his brother Thomas, Robert Toombs, Robert Barnwell Rhett, and Alexander Stephens. This Constitution explicitly mentioned slavery 10 times. Cobb served as temporary head of the six-state Confederate States of America for 2 weeks until Jefferson Davis was selected as president of the self-declared new nation and was inaugurated on February 18, 1861. Alexander Stephens of Georgia was declared vice president of the Confederacy. President-elect Lincoln had written to Stephens on December 22nd, as the Republicans had insisted throughout his campaign. He had no intention of abolishing slavery where it existed, only prohibiting its spread to other territories. But of course, to stop slavery's expansion, in their minds, would have been to end it. So effective was the sermon, Mutual Relation of Masters and Slaves, as taught in the Bible, at the Presbyterian Church of Augusta, Georgia on August 6, 1861, that the congregation quickly raised the money to publish it. Its author, the 25-year-old clergyman Joseph Ruggles Wilson, based his text, on Ephesians 6, verses 5 through 9. The passage begins, "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ," affirming that the Greek word translated as servants distinctly and unequivocally signified slaves. Wilson saw slavery as a permanent Christian institution, expounding the Southern Church's doctrine, which had occasioned a break with their Northern denominations counterparts. He proposed that as servants of Christ, masters should treat their slaves with love and slaves should work hard. This was the doctrine known as paternalism, in which slaves and masters were portrayed as forming a big family until it was time to sell some of the family off because the father had gotten in financial trouble. Only 15 days before Georgia seceded, Wilson told his parishioners to prepare for the upcoming victorious struggle, speaking of slavery as something to cherish. He said, "We should begin to meet the infidel fanaticism of our infatuated enemies upon the elevated ground of the divine warrant for the institution we are resolved to cherish." The Apostle Paul, as much as says that it is unnecessary to fear that this long cherished institution will first give way before the enemies who press upon it without fear. If slaveholders preserve it as an element of social welfare in the spirit of the Christian religion, throwing into it the full measure of the gospel salt allotted to it, and casting around it the same guardianship with which they would protect their family peace if threatened on some other ground, they need apprehend nothing but their own dereliction of duty to themselves and to their dependent servants. He closed by anticipating prosperity for slaveholders and holiness for the enslaved. He said, "Oh, when the oh, when that welcome day shall dawn, whose light will reveal a world covered with righteousness. Not the least pleasing sight will be the institution of domestic slavery, which, by saving a lower race from the destruction of heathenism, has under divine management contributed to refine, exalt, and enrich its superior race." So, this is a part of that whole thing I sometimes talk about, that there's a doctrine of the Bible extrapolated out by various people who have read the Bible and have given their interpretation through their lens. And then there's what the Bible actually says. And what this man says what he just did was he sold us on the idea of a heaven or a hell that exists off this planet. And that's not at all what the reality of the situation is. But I'll continue. We do not know whether Wilson's son Woodrow attended his father's sermon that Sunday during secession winter because had just turned 4, but his subsequent writings as a historian and his adult actions suggest that he absorbed the racist message of his father. You hear that? He was just as racist as his father, with whom he had a lifelong loving relationship with. Rather than submit to the Black Republicans, or so went the rhetoric, Mississippi seceded on January 9th, 1861, followed by Florida, which had only been a state for 15 years. Then on January 10th, Alabama on the 11th, and Georgia on the 19th of January, 1861. On January 21st, five Southern senators withdrew from Congress. In his brief valedictory speech, Jefferson Davis, owner of 113 slaves, said, "It has been a belief that we are to be deprived in the Union of the rights which our fathers bequeathed to us, which has brought Mississippi to her present decision. She has heard proclaimed the theory that all men are created free and equal, and this made the basis of an attack upon her social institutions, and the sacred Declaration of Independence has been invoked to maintain the position of the equality of the races." Davis went on to explain, as slave owners frequently did, and the U.S. Supreme Court had affirmed that all men were created equal, had not been intended to mean all men. Jefferson's youngest grandson, George Wythe Randolph, who as a boy stood by Jefferson's deathbed, apparently agreed. He was the Confederate Secretary of War for 8 months in 1862. Neither Virginia nor Maryland had seceded when Louisiana's P.G.T. Beauregard, giving the orders of slavery, fired on the flag, in Ulysses S. Grant's words, on April 12, 1861, at Fort Sumter. Virginia did much business with the North and was decidedly ambivalent about seceding. The Confederate Constitution, signed as of March 11th, offered Virginia both carrot and stick. The document was modeled on the U.S. Constitution, complete with a three-fifths clause, but with explicit protections for slavery written into the document. However, even despite the latter-day clamor to reopen the African trade, the Confederate institution prohibited the foreign slave trade into the Confederate States with what might as well have been called the Virginia Clause. The carrot was that the Confederate Virginia could continue to slave breed and thus retain her market capitalization of its enslaved population, with importation prohibited and conquest continuing. Virginia slave owners could sell Black people into new domains for the foreseeable future, but the stick was that since no foreign slaves could be traded into the Confederate States, if Virginia did not secede, she would have no Southern market in which to sell African American youth. Virginia gave in and joined the Confederacy, facing the loss of the state's biggest industry, slave breeding. A Virginia Secession Commission voted provisionally to secede on April 17th, 5 days after South Carolina fired the first shot at Fort Sumter, and after Lincoln had called for 75,000 troops from all of the states remaining in the Union. After Virginia ratified secession on May 23rd, West Virginia, where slave labor had never been much in use, seceded from Virginia, voting itself a Union state on October 24th. The day after Virginia seceded, Union troops moved into Alexandria, beginning the longest occupation of a long war. They surprised the Confederate cavalry eating breakfast at the Duke Street slave shipping compound that had formerly been Franklin and Armfield's, and at that time was on the fifth owner, Mr. Charles M. Price, who had been a partner with James Birch in Birch and who had been a partner with James Birch and Price Birch. The firm had fled, wrote Virginia M.D. Conway, and taken with it its saleable articles, but a single one remained, an old man chained to the middle of the floor by the leg. He was released, and the ring and chain which bound him sent to the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, the slave pen, it was known, was reposed as a prison for captured Confederates. A divided Maryland did not secede, but continued to have slavery and was heavily occupied by the military. It was fundamental it was a fundamental priority for the United States to keep Maryland because if Maryland went, Washington would be surrounded. Kentucky did not cede. John C. Breckinridge was seated as a senator from Kentucky, subsequently enlisted in the Confederate Army, and was formally expelled from the Senate as a traitor on December 2nd, 1861. Missouri, the most bitterly divided state, did not cede, but a faction announced a provisional Confederate government in the town of Neosho. The capital of the Confederacy was moved from Montgomery to Richmond by May 20th, 1861. Vote of Confederate Congress. In 82 years, Richmond had gone from being the capital of Virginia's secession from Britain to being the great wholesale center of the domestic slave trade, to being the Confederate capital. Prices for slaves remained strong, and slave sales continued until the city fell to the Union in 1865. Richmond versus Washington. The capitals of the North and South were only 100 miles apart. Among the defects of Steven Spielberg's film, Lincoln, from 2012, was the short shrift it gave Elizabeth Keckley. Though depicted in the movie as a servant, she was the first African American courier of note. Born enslaved in Virginia and badly abused during slavery, after manumission, Miss Keckley, as she was addressed, married and divorced, then opened her own dressmaker shop as a modiste in Washington, D.C. At one she had simultaneously clients of Varina Davis, the wife of Jefferson Davis, at the time a Mississippi senator, and Mary Todd Lincoln. She became a confidant of the unpopular Mrs. Lincoln and was frequently present in the White House. Her 1868 memoir, Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and Four in the White House, was written with the abolitionist journalist Ralph Redpath, who probably transcribed and tweaked her speech to create an as told to text. It would make a fine movie, complete with the unique close up view of Lincoln and his short lived son, Tad, watching their pet goats play on the White House grounds. In it, Miss Keckley reported a conversation with Varina Davis. While dressing her one day, she said to me, "Lizzie, you are so very handy that I should take you south with me." "When do you go south, Miss Davis?" I inquired. "Oh, I cannot just now tell you just now, but it will be soon. You know there is going to be war, Lizzie." "No, but I'll tell you yes." "Who will go to war?" I asked. "The North and the South," was her reply. "The Southern people will not submit to the humiliating demands of the Abolition Party. They will fight first. And which do you think will whip?" "The South, of course. The South is impulsive. is in earnest, and Southern soldiers will fight to conquer. The North will yield when it sees the South in earnest rather than engage in a long and bloody war. But, Miss Davis, are you certain that there will be war? Certain. I know it. You had better go south with me. I will take good care of you. This woman was a business owner. I will take good care of you. Then I may come back to Washington in a few months and live in the White House. The Southern people talk of choosing Mr. Davis for their president. In fact, it may be considered settled that he will be their president. As soon as we go south and cede from the other states, we will raise an army and march on Washington, and then I shall live in the White House. The Yankees wouldn't fight. Varina would live in the White House. New York would collapse without the money it stole from the Southern cotton producers, and the poor would riot and burn down the mansions of Fifth Avenue. This was a common belief. Lazarus Strauss, son of Oscar, who would have been 9 or 10 years old at the time, vividly recalled hearing Georgia Senator Robert Toombs speak at Columbus's Masonic Temple. He drew a large white handkerchief from his pocket as a flourish, and pausing before mopping his perspiring forehead, he exclaimed, "The Yankees will not and cannot fight. I will guarantee to wipe up with this handkerchief every drop of blood that is spilt. Toombs' ghost must be mopping up the blood still. At the time he made that extravagant remark, he hoped to become the Confederate president, as did Howell Cobb. But Jefferson Davis had the most military credentials, and running a war was going to be pretty much the Confederate president's only job. Davis's older brother Joseph had for years been promoting him as the obvious chief executive of an inevitable Southern republic. In order to keep his talented sibling free of financial worries, Joseph, his older brother, had given him the plantation called Brighterfield, 20 miles south of Vicksburg, whose captives were capably overseen during Jefferson Davis's extended absences by an enslaved man, Davis's longtime body servant, James Pemberton. Many in North and South alike believed that Lincoln would be no match for a warrior like Davis, who was unanimously named President of the Confederate States of America by the hastily convened Confederate Congress, which met in secret during its entire existence. And that is the end of chapter 44. When we come back on Thursday, we'll be reading the last two chapters of this book, chapter 45 and 46. Like tonight, it's going to be a long reading, but hopefully we will get through this book and be done with it finally. I know that it has taken us a long time to get through this material, and for that I apologize. This was a long book. It was almost 1,000 pages, and it's in small print. And it covers a lot of interesting things of history, like the homosexuals that tried to reinstate slavery that were kicked out of Honduras. It covers the fact that Thomas Jefferson was no friend of the United States or the black man. He was actually an enemy of the black man, talking about our natural increase and our ability to reproduce under the conditions that we were in on a consistent basis that could continue to make the people that held us as enslaved persons rich and wealthy. He talks about the fact that although we like to remember Benjamin Franklin as an abolitionist, Benjamin Franklin was really a white nationalist that wanted a white nation. and he made his money in his younger days off of advertising the sale of enslaved Africans, and he made his money off of advertising the idea that off of advertising runaway slaves. So these are the people that were in power and the people that we remember and revere throughout history. So as you can see, we continue to have these conversations to this very day. People that are on the right side of history but want to be remembered in a certain way, and people that are on the wrong side of history that want to be remembered in a certain way. We have to be clear-eyed about the history that we study and what it actually means. I put up a couple of articles about what a unionist is, what an abolitionist is, and how neither one of them were really the friend of African people. Because even in this text, it talks about the fact that there were unionists that owned slaves, there were abolitionists that owned slaves, and that these people did not have any interest in the overall well being of the African. They simply were looking out for their own financial interests. I want to thank you, Sister Raw, for being here with me tonight and everyone else that's listening, which includes Bawana Haguziki, Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, The Forecast Radio, Sister Cassidra Cheek, I Can Fire, Anthony McPhail, Real Black Gentleman, KW Don 7, and so many others. I value each and every one of you for being here. I thank you for tuning in. I appreciate the fact that you spend this time with me. I will be back on Thursday to finish the book. Be ready to settle in. We'll probably be here until 11:30 because it's quite a few pages, but it's only 2 chapters. And we can finally be done with this book so we can get to Kebuka and something else more exciting. All right. Thank you so much for tuning in. Peace, guys.